River Rhine was scheduled for the 17th of September 1944. However, with less than a week to go, there were already major problems. British planners had underestimated the sheer quantity of supplies the operation would need. They were forced to recommend to the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower, that the offensive be postponed for a week. Eisenhower knew that German resistance was stiffening daily, and any delay would mean a stronger German defense and heavier Allied casualties. To the fury of his American generals, he ordered resources shifted from the south to support Market Garden. Allied commanders believed that the area of the planned attack was lightly defended. A persistent mist over the landing zones had hampered reconnaissance, and although there were reports that the remnants of several panzer divisions were in the region, these reports were dismissed. By the 17th of September, as planned, 3 airborne divisions were ready to drop deep behind enemy lines. To pave the way for Operation Market Garden, on September the 16th, Allied bombers launched heavy attacks in and around the target area. German army barracks and local air defenses were hit repeatedly. The following morning, the airborne landings began. Because of a shortage of transport aircraft, the landing forces had to be dropped in waves, even though it weakened the impact of the assault. As the first wave of nearly 20,000 paratroops and glidermen dropped into 3 main landing zones, only a few aircraft were shot down. However, many gliders broke their tow ropes and were lost. Of the 3 attacking formations, it was the British 1st Airborne Division that was charged with securing the operation's main objective, the bridge over the River Rhine at Arnhem. Because of the fear of heavy flak around the town, 1st Airborne had dropped 8 miles away. There was already the risk of losing the element of surprise. But to make matters worse, by a stroke of bad luck, the lost gliders contained nearly all the force's armored jeeps. Even at this stage, the division was having trouble with its radios, but there was worse to come. Almost immediately, the force ran into the 9th SS Panzer Division and found itself involved in heavy fighting. While the British 1st Airborne Division had landed west of the Rhine Bridge at Arnhem, the American 82nd Airborne had landed near Nijmegen, intending to seize bridges over the River Waal and on the Meuse. Meanwhile, the US 101st Airborne had landed just north of Eindhoven, aiming to secure bridges over nearby canals. At the same time as the airborne attacks, a ground assault, spearheaded by the British 30th Corps, had struck northeast and was aiming to meet up with the airborne formations dropped behind enemy lines. The initial wave of 1st Airborne Division, dropped outside Arnhem, had been blocked by 9th SS Panzer Division at the village of Oosterbeek. Only 500 paratroops of the 2nd Parachute Battalion succeeded in getting into Arnhem. The battalion seized the northern end of the Rhine Bridge, but elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division prevented a crossing, and the battalion was isolated. A second wave of paratroops was dropped at Oosterbeek and attempted to break into Arnhem, but was blocked by the Germans. The Allies tried to airdrop supplies to 1st Airborne, but the target was missed and the supplies fell into German hands. The 1st Polish Parachute Brigade landed south of the Rhine, meaning to link up with the British, but the Poles were foiled by a strong German defense. There was still no sign of the Allied ground forces supposed to link up with 1st Airborne. On the 21st of September, the British force holding the northern end of the bridge at Arnhem surrendered. It had lost half its men. 4 days later, 2,000 survivors of the 1st Airborne Division's battle at Oosterbeek withdrew back across the Rhine, leaving Arnhem to the Germans. Although Operation Market Garden had failed in its main objective to capture a bridge over the Rhine, there had been some success elsewhere. 30th Corps had relieved the American 101st Airborne at Wegel, and the next day had pushed on to meet 82nd Airborne south of Nijmegen. After hard fighting, and in spite of fierce German counterattacks, the 82nd had succeeded in capturing the Waal Bridge. For General Eisenhower, in spite of the success of some of the airborne forces, the failure of Market Garden to deliver the promised Rhine crossing proved the folly of a narrow front attack. As for Montgomery, his reputation had suffered a severe blow, and he would never regain his former influence with the Supreme Commander. By the early autumn of 1944, the industrial might of the United States had given the Allies overwhelming superiority over their German enemies. The Western Allies could muster 14,000 planes and over 2,000 tanks on the Western Front. On the ground, 56 divisions were organized into 3 massive army groups behind a front 500 miles long. As well as their overwhelming superiority on the ground, the Allies also outnumbered the Germans by 25 to 1 in aircraft. Both the British Royal Air Force and the American Army Air Force had large numbers of ground attack planes, organized into tactical units. Fighter bombers such as the British Hawker Typhoon and the American P-47 Thunderbolt operated in close support of every Allied ground operation. When the weather allowed, large numbers roamed behind German lines, pouncing on anything that moved, and almost completely depriving the Germans of daytime mobility. Meanwhile, Allied motor transport and armor could mass behind the front with little fear of disruption. General Eisenhower's 3 army groups were the 21st, 12th, and 6th. The 21st Army Group was commanded by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery fielded the British Second Army with 6 armored, 8 infantry, and 2 airborne divisions, and the Canadian First Army with 2 armored, 3 infantry divisions, and 1 armored brigade. 12th Army Group was commanded by General Omar Bradley. Bradley had 1st Army with 2 armored and 2 infantry divisions. Third Army with 1 armoured and 7 infantry divisions, and Ninth Army, also with 1 armoured and 7 infantry divisions. The 6th Army Group had come up from southern France and was commanded by General Jacob L. Devers. Devers had the 7th United States Army with 1 armoured, 5 infantry and 1 airborne division, and 1st French Army with 3 armoured divisions, 1 motorised division, 1 mountain and 3 infantry divisions. While the Allied advance was halted by the German victory at Arnhem and by continued supply problems, the Wehrmacht in the west set feverishly about reinforcing its defences. The generally poor quality of replacement manpower was still a serious weakness, although 1 high-caliber formation was created in September. The 30,000-strong 1st Parachute Army was formed from a corps of 6 Luftwaffe parachute regiments and would acquit itself well in the coming battles. With the defending army groups down to barely more than 100 tanks, panzer reinforcements were desperately needed. Although during September, nearly 500 heavy tanks and tank destroyers were sent west in 10 new brigades, their inexperience would count against them. Meanwhile, there were plans to raise a new panzer army, the 6th, which would be available for offensive operations. But as yet, there were too few new tanks available. German Army Group B was deployed on the Northwest Front and was commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model. Model had the 15th and 7th Infantry Armies, the newly formed 1st Paratroop Army, and 5th Panzer Army. Army Group G held the southern sector of the front, commanded by General Hermann Balck. Army Group G had 1st and 19th Armies. Altogether, the 2 German army groups on the Western Front had 6 panzer divisions, along with 10 independent panzer brigades, 9 motorized infantry divisions, and 46 infantry and parachute divisions. By late September 1944, in the wake of the failure of Operation Market Garden, the Allies had been forced to realize that the war was not going to be won by the end of the year. Supplies were still a problem, and while the Allied armies were building up for the next major offensive, the generals had to decide whether to dig in and take up defensive positions for the winter, or maintain pressure on the Wehrmacht by relentless attacks. Already the weather had turned cold and wet, but Allied commanders decided to give the Germans no breathing space. A limited offensive would be launched to push the front right up to the Siegfried Line. At the same time, in order to open up the port of Antwerp, a concerted effort would be made to clear the remaining Germans from their island sanctuaries in the Scheldt estuary. It was units of the German 15th Army that continued to resist in the Scheldt estuary, and along with dense German minefields, blocked Allied access to the port of Antwerp. On the 1st of October, the Canadian First Army attacked, with its main thrust towards the German stronghold on Beaverland. German resistance was determined, but by the 16th, Woensdrecht was captured, trapping the Germans on the peninsula. The Canadians cleared the northern coast of the mainland, but it took 2 more weeks to reach Goes and secure the peninsula. The Germans were forced to flee to Walcheren. On the 1st of November, the British Royal Air Force bombed Walcheren's dikes, flooding much of the island. The 1st Canadian Army then launched a powerful amphibious attack. It took a week of fierce fighting before Walcheren was in Allied hands. Only then could the task of sweeping the estuary for mines begin. By now, the Allied front was advancing towards the Siegfried Line. The line was defended by the German 7th Army in the north and the 1st and 5th Panzer and 19th Armies in the south. The British 2nd Army attacked north and southeast through the Peel marshes, while the US 3rd Army began pushing through the heavily defended Saar region, with its right flank laying siege to Metz. As the 7th Army struck towards Strasbourg and the French attacked through Belfort, the US 1st and 9th Armies, pushing towards Aachen, entered the Hürtgen Forest, an area of more than 30 square miles. The intention was to capture the city and push on towards the Siegfried Line. The drive through the Hürtgen Forest in early October 1944 was supposed to be part of a limited offensive. What no one had expected was that it would turn into a major battle, and one of the bloodiest yet fought by American troops. Once inside the Hürtgen Forest, the Americans quickly found that the German 1st Parachute Army had strongly fortified every town and village in their path. Even worse, the west wall ran right through the middle of the forest, and its defenses had been heavily reinforced. Nor could the Americans get help from their normally overwhelming air power. The forest was simply too dense for accurate bombing. The city of Aachen was the most strongly defended in the Hürtgen Forest area, and one of the Allies' main objectives. The Germans put up a determined fight, inflicting heavy casualties on the Americans. But on the 21st of October, Aachen fell. It was the first German city to be captured by the Allies. The grim battle in the Hürtgen Forest continued for another 3 weeks, until finally, in early December, 1st and 9th Armies reached the banks of the River Roer. The struggle to clear the Hürtgen Forest had cost the 2 American armies 35,000 dead and wounded, and reduced several divisions to tatters. Further south, Patton's 3rd Army had also faced stiff opposition, especially around Metz. The city eventually fell on the 18th of November. Just over a week later, 3rd Army began its assault on the Siegfried Line. By the first week of December, despite fierce German resistance, American men and armor were pouring through the breaches. While Third Army had been smashing its way through the Siegfried Line, the First French Army had secured the Belfort region and was steadily destroying the 19th German Army. On the 23rd of November, the US 7th Army had reached Strasbourg, and the following day, the city fell to the French troops of the Army's 2nd Division. By now, the Scheldt estuary had been cleared of mines, and the first Allied merchant ships had entered the port of Antwerp. In its first week of operations, the port handled more than 10,000 tons of supplies a day, and the figure was rising fast. Allied commanders were now confident that their armies would soon be fully supplied and would be ready to launch a full-scale offensive against Germany early in the new year. In the drive to conquer the German homeland, the Allies would have to cross several major obstacles before they would even reach the River Rhine. With the Siegfried Line now breached in several places, the next great barrier was the River Roer. Engineers using models of the Roer and its surrounding countryside were already trying to predict for Allied planners what would happen if the Germans flooded the river and how the attacking forces might cope. As plans intended to deal with this and countless other contingencies were devised, the Allies were confident that all such obstacles could be overcome. What no one amongst the Allied commanders suspected was that the Germans were not going to wait passively for the great offensive to begin. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, expecting to sit out the winter in relative peace, were to be the victims of one of the most audacious counterattacks in history. Hitler and his senior Wehrmacht commanders had been planning to launch a major counteroffensive against the Allies since mid-September. The objective of the attack was to capture Antwerp. Not only would the capture or destruction of Antwerp prevent supplies reaching the Allied armies, it would also split Allied forces in two, demoralizing the alliance and forcing its leaders to negotiate. For the attack, Hitler concentrated the best of his remaining forces in the west. 240,000 men in 28 divisions, with 1,200 tanks and assault guns. The offensive began at 05:30 on December the 16th, with a barrage by 900 German guns. 1 hour later, 3 German armies smashed into the American front line. By now, the front line in the west followed the course of the Roer, Our, and Saar rivers. In southern Belgium, the line faced the Ardennes, a hilly and in places heavily wooded region. It was through this area that Hitler intended to thrust towards the bridges over the River Meuse and the port of Antwerp. For the attack, the Germans had deployed the newly formed 6th Panzer Army, together with the 5th Panzer and 7th Army, facing the weak gap between the American 1st and 9th Armies. Although the thrust by the 6th Panzer Army made slow progress, a spearhead managed to break through the American line and dashed headlong for the Meuse. To the south, 5th Panzer Army punched right through the inexperienced 106th Division, but then its advance was slowed by the veteran 28th. Eventually, 5th Panzer Army did break through, reaching Saint-Vite and the vital road junction of Bastogne. However, the Germans failed to take the town, which was soon reinforced by the American 101st Airborne Division. Although some German units then bypassed Bastogne and charged for the Meuse, the main advance was blocked. To Allied commanders, the German offensive through the Ardennes had come as a stunning blow. No one had believed that the Germans were capable of mounting a large-scale attack. Nor had anyone imagined that Hitler would be so foolish as to risk his last remaining forces in one great gamble. The shock was deepened by the German use of special units, dressed and equipped as Americans, to sow confusion and mistrust in the American ranks. The Germans' success in the attack so far had been in part due to the weather. Many of the attacking troops were veterans of the Eastern Front and accustomed to the harsh wintry conditions. Dense cloud cover had also denied the Americans use of their reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft. However, in spite of these advantages, the attack was already behind schedule. The Americans had refused to surrender at Bastogne, while elsewhere, blown bridges had slowed the advance, and all German units were suffering from a desperate shortage of fuel. Meanwhile, the Allies were recovering from the first shock of the onslaught. Almost at once, Eisenhower had moved to try and stabilize the situation in the Ardennes. Although it angered some American generals, he transferred command of the US 1st and 9th Armies away from Bradley and gave it to Montgomery, who was north of the Bulge and so better placed to command. Montgomery acted quickly, reinforcing the Meuse bridges with the British 30th Corps, while the 1st and 9th rallied and blocked any further German advance towards the river. While Montgomery was strengthening the Allied defense in the north, Patton's Third Army had made an extraordinarily rapid 90-degree wheel and had ploughed into the German southern flank. On the 26th of December, the 3rd broke through to relieve the defenders of Bastogne. Already the weather had cleared, unleashing Allied air power, while crippled by lack of fuel, the Germans ground to a halt at Dinant. The Allies had contained the German thrust, and now they began to squeeze out the massive bulge in the line caused by the German advance. Allied forces met up at Houffalize, and by the end of January, they had pushed the Germans back to their start positions. In the struggle that became known as the Battle of the Bulge, the Allies had lost almost 90,000 men, killed, wounded, and captured, nearly all of them Americans. The Germans had lost 120,000, many of them because Hitler had refused to allow a timely withdrawal, even when the offensive had clearly failed. 600 German tanks had been destroyed, along with vast numbers of heavy weapons of all types. Months of the Reich's war production had been expended for nothing. Although at the Bulge the United States had won a sizable victory, the battle in the Ardennes had forced Eisenhower to face several uncomfortable facts. In the early stages of the fighting, American morale had fallen apart. Thousands had deserted, and the first GI for nearly 100 years had been executed for cowardice. For the Supreme Commander, it was a worrying picture, and the situation was made more difficult by the attitude of Field Marshal Montgomery. Shortly after the battle, Montgomery had hinted publicly that as he had been given temporary command of the US 1st and 9th Armies, he had saved the Americans from certain defeat. The American generals were furious, and Eisenhower threatened to resign if Montgomery did not do so first. By the start of 1945, relations between the American and British military had sunk to a new low. However, the crisis was averted when Montgomery apologized to Eisenhower. Even the willful and stubborn British Field Marshal had been forced to concede that with the Allies about to embark on the last great attack on Nazi Germany, unity was everything. The German counterattack in the Ardennes had succeeded in delaying the Allied push on the Rhine by only 6 weeks. By the end of January 1945, the supplies needed for the Great Assault were almost in place, and all 3 Allied army groups were poised to launch the offensive. Each army group had devised its own plans for reaching the River Rhine. Montgomery's 21st had a 2-pronged strategy, Operation Veritable and Operation Grenade, both timed to begin on the 8th of February. Both prongs involved attacks through a heavily wooded region called the Reichswald. However, unknown to the Allies, the German 1st Parachute Army had heavily reinforced the Reichswald right in the path of the offensive. The climate also favored the Germans. By now, the winter snow had begun to thaw. Floods and mud would seriously reduce the attackers' mobility. Operation Veritable, the 21st Army Group's northern thrust, began on schedule on the 8th of February. The greatest artillery barrage yet seen in the West numbed the first line of defenders. However, as British and Canadian troops plunged into the wooded region of the Reichswald, the 1st Parachute Army put up a bitter fight, holding out for more than a week. The Canadians and British finally captured the towns of Cleve and Goch and broke through to secure the west bank of the Rhine, from Emmerich to the German town of Wesel. The 21st Army Group's southern thrust, Operation Grenade, was to be mounted by the US 9th Army and was to attack towards Düsseldorf and Cologne. Facing the Americans were divisions of the German 15th Army. The operation was meant to begin at the same time as the northern attack, but the Germans opened the Rohr dams and flooded much of the region. It took 2 weeks for the Rohr floods to subside, and only then could the Americans advance. Once the attack got going, it made good progress. By the 2nd of March, 9th Army had secured positions on the west bank of the Rhine. 2 days later, elements of First Army also reached the river, and on the 5th, they entered the suburbs of Cologne. German resistance in Cologne was particularly fierce. The defenders clung to every pile of rubble, and the process of clearing the city was agonizing and costly. It was 2 days before Cologne finally surrendered. To the south, 12th Army Group, with the American First Army and elements of Third Army, had begun its two-pronged drive to the Rhine. Facing the Americans were the German 5th Panzer Army and the 15th and 7th Armies. Operation Lumberjack made good progress, heading through the Eifel region towards Koblenz. As the Allies advanced closer to the Rhine, they meant only to secure the West Bank. However, on the 7th of March, elements on the extreme right flank of the US First Army approached the Rhine close to the town of Remagen, only to discover that a bridge had been left intact. As the 9th Armoured Division had driven through Remagen, they had expected to find the railway bridge over the Rhine had been blown by the Germans. However, the Germans' main explosive charges had failed to detonate, and the reserve charges had weakened the bridge, but had failed to destroy it. At once, the astonished Americans raced to seize the crossing. The American commanders, Bradley and Eisenhower, had seen the possibility of capturing a bridge over the Rhine intact as extremely remote. No plans had been made for such an unlikely event. All that Bradley could do was to rush the nearest units to the bridge and get them across as fast as was humanly possible. Almost at once, a force struck out to sever the main German autobahn between Frankfurt and Cologne. While 21st Army Group was closing to the Rhine opposite Wesel, and in the center, the Remagen bridgehead was being secured, 12th and 6th Army Groups had also been making progress. 3rd Army was pushing closer to Koblenz, and 7th, together with the right flank of 3rd Army, had begun Operation Undertone, clearing an area up to the Rhine between Koblenz and Strasbourg. The French First Army had finally liquidated the last pocket of German resistance around Colmar, and by the end of March 1945, the Allies held a line running the whole length of the River Rhine. For the Germans, the loss of the bridge at Remagen had been a stunning blow. The enemy had crossed Germany's greatest river frontier almost without a fight. As news of the latest disaster had reached Hitler, he had flown into an uncontrollable rage. The commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht in the West, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, was fired, and the officers who had failed to blow the bridge were shot. Hitler was determined to destroy the bridge at Remagen, and for the first and only time, the V-2 rocket was used as a tactical weapon. The attacks failed. In any case, nothing could now prevent a massive Allied offensive along the whole length of the River Rhine and into the German heartland. Even before the three Allied army groups had closed up to the Rhine, the staffs of each had begun to plan for the final crossing. Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group planned a powerful amphibious assault, codenamed Operation Plunder. For the attack, naval landing craft had been transported overland to the front, and 250,000 tons of supplies had been stockpiled. With 3 full-strength armies and 5,000 artillery pieces, Montgomery intended to seize a substantial bridgehead over the Rhine, and then, maintaining the momentum, strike deep into Germany. Operation Plunder would be reinforced by Operation Varsity, a powerful assault by the US 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne Divisions with 3,000 aircraft and gliders. These forces would be dropped east of the Rhine to enlarge the bridgehead. Operations Plunder and Varsity were scheduled to begin on March the 24th. While the 21st Army Group was making final preparations for its enormous set-piece attack across the Rhine, Bradley's 12th Army Group, including Patton's 3rd Army, was finalizing its own plans. Patton's men had reached the Rhine later than Montgomery, and there had been no time to build up anything like the same vast quantities of fuel and ammunition. Patton was keen to press on regardless. He was determined to outdo First Army's achievement at Remagen, and above all, to beat Montgomery to a Rhine crossing. In the middle of the night of the 22nd of March, less than 2 weeks after Patton's men had reached the Rhine, 5th Division succeeded in winning a bridgehead. Patton had beaten Montgomery by 2 full days. On the night of the 23rd of March, a huge Lancaster attack hammered the German town of Wesel, directly across the Rhine from where Montgomery's 21st Army Group was poised to launch Operation Plunder. After a short but intense artillery barrage, the Allied amphibious crossings began. Protected by a massive smoke screen, the crossings continued through the night and into the next day. German resistance was sporadic. At 9 a.m. on the morning of the 24th of March, the parachute landings began just north of Wesel. Even though German anti-aircraft batteries inflicted heavy casualties on the paratroops and gliders, the landing forces made good progress. Soon they had linked up with the ground formations to attack Wesel itself. The German 1st Parachute Army resisted fiercely, but by the 25th of March, the last of the defenders had fled or been captured. Within 3 days, the Wesel bridgehead was 25 miles deep and 25 miles wide. With 21st Army Group's capture of its bridgehead at Wesel, Montgomery's men were now on the threshold of the Ruhr, well placed to seize Germany's industrial center. 12th Army Group's 1st Army continued to cross at Remagen, while Patton's 3rd Army, already across at Oppenheim, won 2 more bridgeheads further north. Meanwhile, 7th Army crossed near Worms, and the French First Army crossed at Germersheim. By the end of March, the east bank of the River Rhine was a chain of Allied bridgeheads. On March the 28th, General Eisenhower announced that the Western Allies would not be capturing Berlin. Although at the Yalta Conference the Allied leaders had agreed that after the war Berlin would fall in the Soviet occupation zone, the British, and especially Winston Churchill, still believed that a drive on the German capital should be mounted. It would at least serve to ensure that when the Germans surrendered, more territory would be in Western hands. However, Eisenhower refused to back any such idea. To him, it seemed pointless to expend lives on capturing ground that would, in any case, have to be handed over to the Soviets when the war was over. It was not only Churchill who was dismayed by the American refusal to push east. Montgomery, too, was infuriated, although for quite different reasons. The German capital lay in Montgomery's path, and he had looked forward to capturing the greatest prize of the European war. To make matters worse, his role in encircling the Ruhr had also been downgraded on Eisenhower's orders. Bradley's 12th Army Group would complete the Ruhr encirclement, while Montgomery's forces would only play a supporting role. For weeks, German Army Group B had been heavily reinforcing the Ruhr region. Although most of its industries continued to function, the Ruhr was by now almost cut off from the rest of Germany by the Allies' carefully targeted bombing of rail centers, bridges, and viaducts. Nevertheless, the Ruhr was still seen by Hitler as absolutely vital to the defense of the Reich, and the whole area was being turned into a fortress. The commander of Army Group B, Field Marshal Model, had set up his headquarters inside the Ruhr. Model had 15th Army and 5th Panzer Army, along with elements of other formations numbering more than 200,000 men. Orders were to hold out to the very end. The Allied strategy for dealing with the massive concentration of German forces in the Ruhr was to encircle the area with 2 deep thrusts. Starting on March the 28th, 7 armies broke out of their Rhine bridgeheads and smashed into the German defense. The Allied plan was that in the north, the British Second Army was to drive in the direction of Hamburg and down the River Elbe. The Canadians, starting a few days later, would clear Holland and the North German coast. Meanwhile, Patton's Third would drive into central Germany, and to the south, the US 7th Army and the French First Army would push down to the line of the Danube. In the center, while most of the US 1st and 9th Armies encircled the Ruhr, some units would push on to the Elbe. No Allied forces were to cross the river. East of the Elbe was to be left to the Russians. As the offensive opened and the Second British Army drove northeast, On its right, the US Ninth Army smashed into German Army Group B and swung around the Ruhr. At the same time, Third Army took Frankfurt against fierce German resistance and met up with First Army at Gießen. The German 89th Corps was encircled, and a wedge had been driven between Army Groups B and G. First Army went on to complete the encirclement of the Ruhr from the south by meeting 9th Army at Lippstadt on April the 1st. The German 15th Army, 5th Panzer Army, and most of the 1st Parachute Army were now trapped in the Ruhr. In the Ruhr pocket, an area 30 miles by 70 miles, was the last great concentration of German forces in the west. The encircled units made one attempt after another to break the ring, but their efforts were weak and uncoordinated. The Germans were also trying to form a new army to the east, 11th Army, which could break through to the Ruhr and relieve the pocket. But they failed to assemble more than a handful of already weak divisions. However, the sudden appearance of SS battle groups from inside the pocket, mounting fierce counterattacks, caused anxious moments for Allied commanders. Rather than simply contain the Ruhr pocket with the minimum of forces, General Bradley now decided to defeat the trapped German armies in the Ruhr. The result was nearly 3 weeks of difficult and frustrating action. Although some cities and towns surrendered at once, others saw fanatical last stands in the rubble of bombed-out factories and streets. Although it took 18 American divisions nearly 3 weeks to end all resistance, the outcome of the Ruhr battle was never in doubt. All the same, the scale of the victory astonished Allied commanders. When German resistance finally petered out on April the 18th, 317,000 German prisoners were taken, including 25 generals and an admiral. More prisoners than in the mass surrenders at Stalingrad or Tunisia. Pockets of resistance, some of them strong and determined, would be met by Allied forces until the very end. But nothing could now prevent the Allies from sweeping through the German interior. As the Allied advance raced through Germany, it rapidly approached the Russians, who were themselves now closing in on the River Elbe. There was a real chance of accidental clashes between forward units. To reduce the risk, the Americans and Russians exchanged liaison officers and special recognition signals were devised. Finally, on the 25th of April 1945, Red Army and Western forces met near Torgau on the Elbe, as units of the 5th Soviet Guards Army and the 69th Division of the 1st American Army made contact. Germany had been cut in half. While the Western Allies were eliminating the final pockets of German resistance on their side of the River Elbe, the Russians began the assault on Berlin. Inside the city, Hitler and a handful of followers sheltered in a bunker deep beneath the Reichschancellery, while Berlin was turned to rubble over their heads, and surviving German units resisted fanatically to the end. By the time the city surrendered on May the 2nd, 300,000 Russians and an unknown number of Germans were dead in the ruins. "2 days before the fall of Berlin, Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker. However, although the Führer was gone, German resistance continued. Knowing of the grim fate that awaited them at the hands of the Russians, many German units were determined to fight their way west and surrender to American or British forces. To buy time for units in the east to escape, German formations in the west kept fighting for long after they would otherwise have given up. On May the 4th, German forces in northern Europe surrendered unconditionally to Field Marshal Montgomery, and 3 days later, the remaining German forces in the west surrendered to Eisenhower's staff. On that day, Eisenhower announced that the mission of the Allied forces was complete. Nazi Germany had been utterly destroyed, and after nearly 6 long and bitter years, the war in Europe was over.